The ceremony was called a dégradation militaire. Military degradation. The French army had specific protocols for it. The way armies have specific protocols for everything. Because the military understands that ritual is a form of communication, and this particular ritual was designed to communicate something very specific. A general's adjutant approached Dreyfus. He tore the decorations from Dreyfus's chest. He tore the stripes from his sleeves. He broke Dreyfus's sword over his knee and threw the pieces at Dreyfus's feet. All of this was done while Alfred Dreyfus stood at attention. Then the adjutant stepped back, and Dreyfus was marched around the perimeter of the courtyard past 5,000 soldiers, past the press corps, past the crowd of civilians who had been admitted to watch, while he shouted, repeatedly, in a voice that witnesses described as controlled and desperate simultaneously, Je suis innocent. Vive la France. I am innocent. Long live France. In the crowd outside, Theodor Herzl was writing. He was not yet famous. He was a journalist for the Viennese newspaper Neue Freie Presse, covering French politics. He had been assigned to the Dreyfus story because it was a significant news event. A French army officer convicted of treason, publicly humiliated. The whole thing playing out with a theatrical gravity that the French military could produce when it wanted to make a point. Herzl wrote his dispatch. He filed his story. He went home to Vienna, and he could not stop thinking about what he had heard. 5,000 soldiers' worth of silence, and one man's voice cutting through it, insisting on an innocence that France had officially decided not to hear. 1 year later, Herzl published a book. It was called The Judenstaat, the Jewish State. It is the founding document of modern Zionism. A wrongful conviction in a Paris courtyard in 1894, a piece of manufactured guilt, assembled by officers who needed a scapegoat, and found one set in motion, a chain of events that would, 53 years later, result in the creation of the State of Israel. This is the part of the Dreyfus affair that most people who know the story do not fully appreciate. It was not just one of history's most famous miscarriages of justice. It was a miscarriage of justice whose consequences extended so far beyond the courtroom, so far beyond France, so far beyond the 12 years Alfred Dreyfus spent fighting to clear his name, that the phrase butterfly effect feels inadequate. The butterfly did not just flap its wings. It started a movement that reshaped the map of the Middle East. But before we follow those consequences, we need to understand what the Dreyfus affair actually was, because it was not merely a miscarriage of justice. Those happen all the time, in every country, in every era, and most of them do not reshape the world. The Dreyfus affair was something more specific. It was a case study in how an institution, the French army, in this case, but the specific institution is almost incidental, chooses its reputation over the truth. And what happens when the cover-up becomes more elaborate than the original crime? And it is, in this season's terms, one of the purest examples of the manufactured guilt, the big lie that says, we have decided you are the enemy, and we will construct the evidence to prove it. On or around September 26, 1994, a woman who cleaned the German embassy in Paris and worked simultaneously as an agent for French military intelligence went through the contents of a wastebasket belonging to Lieutenant Colonel Maximilian von Schwarzkoppen, the German military attaché. She found, among the discarded papers, a torn document. It had been ripped into several pieces. Someone had tried to dispose of it but not destroyed. She collected the pieces, reassembled them, and passed them to her French intelligence handler. The document, once reassembled, was what became known as the bordereau, literally a list. A memorandum, written by an unidentified French officer to the German military attaché. It described a set of French military documents that the writer was offering to provide. Specifically, information about hydraulic brakes for field artillery, information about covering troops, information about formation modifications, technical military details of the kind that would be useful to a foreign intelligence service and constituted, in the legal language of 1,894 France, treason. French military intelligence, the Section de Statistique, which was the counterintelligence unit of the French army. Despite its deliberately boring name, began the investigation. The task: identify who had written the bordereau. This task required answering a question. What kind of officer could have had access to all the military information described in the document? The analysis suggested an artillery officer who had served in multiple bureaus of the General Staff, who with access to diverse technical and operational information. A list of candidates was assembled, 6 or so officers whose profiles broadly matched. Among them, Captain Alfred Dreyfus. Alfred Dreyfus was 35 years old. He was a captain in the French Army's artillery branch. He had graduated near the top of his class from the École Polytechnique and had served with distinction through the ranks. In 1893, he had been posted to the General Staff Headquarters, one of the most prestigious assignments in the French Army, and one from which officers with potential were tracked toward the highest commands. He was also Jewish. In the France of 1894, these two facts, professional excellence and Jewish identity, existed in a tension that the Dreyfus affair would expose with excruciating clarity. France was, legally and constitutionally, a republic built on the principles of the Revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity. The emancipation of French Jews had been lost in 1791. In theory, Alfred Dreyfus was as French as any officer on the General Staff. In theory, French anti-Semitism in the 1890s was not the genocidal variety that the 20th century would make familiar. It was what historians call modern anti-Semitism, shaped less by traditional religious hostility than by the anxieties of industrialization, nationalism, and economic disruption. Jews were associated, in the anti-Semitic imagination of the period, with international finance and cosmopolitan disloyalty, with money rather than land, with Paris rather than true France, with Germany and Austria and the financial networks of the Rothschilds, rather than with the Catholic peasant tradition that French nationalism increasingly romanticized. Drumont's La France Juive, which had sold over 100,000 copies in its first year of publication, argued that France had been economically and culturally invaded by Jews, and that the French nation needed to reclaim itself from their influence. W 1892, Drumont had founded La Libre Parole, which built a mass readership by combining anti-Semitic conspiracy theory with sensationalist journalism. W 1894, La Libre Parole had a circulation of over 200. Ling. This is the media environment into which the Dreyfus case was born. Now let us return to the Section de Statistique and the list of candidates. Colonel Jean Sandher, the head of the Section de Statistique, was by all accounts openly and unreservedly anti-Semitic. His deputy, Colonel Fabre, shared these views. When the list of candidate officers was assembled and the name Alfred Dreyfus appeared on it, the only Jewish officer in the General Staff, Sandher, and his team did not arrive at Dreyfus as the conclusion of a rigorous investigative process. They arrived at him quickly, decided he was likely guilty, and then began looking for evidence to support the conclusion they had already reached. This is the investigative methodology known as confirmation bias. In a courtroom, it is called starting with the verdict and working backward. In an intelligence agency, it produces the kind of catastrophe that the Dreyfus affair became. On October 13, Major Dupaty de Clam summoned Dreyfus to a meeting at the Ministry of War. He told Dreyfus he needed a letter written. The minister had injured his hand. There was urgent correspondence to attend to. He began to dictate. The text he dictated contained phrases lifted from the bordereau. Dupaty was watching Dreyfus's hand as he wrote. Dreyfus' hand, he noted, was trembling. In Dupaty's report, this trembling became evidence of guilt, the physical manifestation of a man confronting the document he had written. The suppressed knowledge of his own treason expressing itself in an involuntary physiological response. Dreyfus, who would spend the next 12 years proving his innocence, said he was cold. It was October in Paris. He had a point. The handwriting samples were sent to 5 experts. 3 found similarities between Dreyfus's writing and the bordereau. 2 explicitly disagreed. The dissenting experts' conclusions were noted and then set aside. The analysis was, in the words of subsequent investigators, completely unreliable. The bordereau handwriting was not, in fact, especially similar to Dreyfus's, but 3 out of 5 had said it was, and the investigation needed it to be. Dreyfus was arrested on October 15. His wife Lucy was not told for days. When she was finally informed, she did what any person who knows their spouse to be innocent would do. She demanded to know on what evidence he had been arrested. The evidence, as it stood at the moment of arrest, consisted of the opinion of 3 out of 5 handwriting experts that the bordereau's handwriting was similar to Dreyfus's, with 2 explicitly dissenting. The fact that Dreyfus was an artillery officer who had served in multiple general staff bureaus, as had approximately a dozen other officers. The fact that he was Jewish, which was not, officially, evidence of anything, but which functioned throughout the investigation as the background assumption that made the other evidence feel sufficient. That was it. That was the case. The Minister of War, General Auguste Mercier, announced publicly that he had irrefutable proof of Dreyfus's guilt. He did not have irrefutable proof. He had 3 handwriting experts and his own prejudice, but he had said it out loud, to the press. And now the Ministry of War's credibility was attached to the verdict before the trial had even begun. When La Libre Parole published the story of the arrest on information leaked from within the Ministry of War, in what was itself an irregular disclosure of an ongoing investigation, the framing was immediate and unambiguous. A Jewish officer had committed treason. The disloyalty of the Jews, which Drumont had been writing about for 8 years, had been confirmed. The mainstream press followed, not all of it with Drumont's virulence. But the story of a Jewish officer accused of selling military secrets to Germany was too large to ignore and too conveniently structured to resist. The investigation had not yet concluded. The trial had not yet begun. But the verdict was already forming in the public mind, fed by a press that had been primed for a decade to find this particular story credible. This is one of the Dreyfus affair's most instructive features, the way in which the press, not as a unified institution with a single agenda, but as a collection of competing publications, each responding to the narrative gravity of a sensational story, functioned to amplify the manufactured guilt before the formal legal process had even had a chance to produce it. The public had decided Dreyfus was guilty. Then the court tried him. The court-martial of Alfred Dreyfus began on December 19, and concluded on December 22, 3 days. For a case involving treason, the gravest charge in military law, 3 days. The proceedings were held in camera, closed to the public and the press, on the grounds that the military secrets involved in the bordereau required secrecy. This reasoning was not entirely unreasonable, but it had the convenient effect of ensuring that no outside observer could examine what was actually happening inside the room. What was happening inside the room was this. Dreyfus's defense attorney, Edgar de Magne, had been provided with the bordereau and with the handwriting analyses. He had not been provided with a secret dossier that the prosecution had assembled a collection of documents that the military claimed further established Dreyfus's guilt. This dossier was shown to the judges without Dreyfus or his attorney being allowed to see it, examine it, or challenge it. The secret dossier was the prosecution's trump card in its primary crime. Without it, the evidence against Dreyfus was 3 dubious handwriting opinions, contested by 2 experts. The fact that Dreyfus was an artillery officer with appropriate general staff access, and the fact that Dreyfus was Jewish, which was never stated as evidence but functioned as the assumption that made the other evidence feel sufficient. That was not enough to convict a man of treason. Any competent defense attorney, and Demange was a good one, could have challenged these elements effectively in open proceedings. With the secret dossier presented to the judges without the defense's knowledge, the calculation changed. The judges were being told, there is more evidence we cannot share with the defense, because it is classified. Evidence that confirms the guilt. The other material merely suggests. The judges accepted this. They did not demand to know why the evidence was too classified to share with a defense attorney who already held security clearance. They did not question the procedural irregularity of evidence being presented to them outside the formal trial proceeding. They accepted the dossier, deliberated, and on December 22, 1894, returned a unanimous verdict. Guilty. Alfred Dreyfus was found guilty of treason by 7 military officers, on the basis of evidence so flimsy that the prosecution had been forced to supplement it with a secret file the defendant was not allowed to see. He was sentenced to public degradation and deportation for life to a fortified enclosure. That night, Dreyfus wrote in the prison diary he had managed to keep, "I am innocent. I swear it on the head of my children." He then wrote to General Mercier, the Minister of War, asking to know what evidence had been used against him. He did not know about the secret dossier. He could not account for how the verdict had been reached. He genuinely did not understand how a court could have found him guilty when he had done nothing. The response from General Mercier was silence. The degradation ceremony on January 5, 1895, was not merely a punishment. It was a communication, an institutional statement, performed in public with all the theatrical gravity the French military could muster, designed to make the verdict of the secret trial feel final, legitimate, and beyond question. The crowd outside the gates among them. Theodor Herzl heard Dreyfus shouting his innocence. Many of them responded by shouting back, "Death to Dreyfus. Death to the Jews. Not death to the traitor." The generic rage at an individual crime. Death to the Jews. The generalization of an individual verdict into a collective accusation. Dreyfus was not being destroyed as an individual criminal. He was being destroyed as a symbol, as the living proof of the thing that Drumont had been arguing for years, that Jews could not be trusted with France, that their loyalties lay elsewhere, that the emancipation of French Jews had been a mistake the country was now paying for. Theodor Herzl heard this. He wrote it down. He went home to Vienna and spent a year thinking about what it meant. Alfred Dreyfus arrived on Devil's Island in April 1895. He was confined to a small stone hut, approximately 15 feet by 13 feet. He was under surveillance 24 hours a day, for a period of several months in 1896, when a false rumor circulated that he had escaped. He was chained to his bed every night with a double iron restraint. The tropical heat was, by the accounts of every observer who wrote about the island, barely survivable for extended periods. Disease was constant. He was not allowed contact with other prisoners. He was permitted to write to his wife, but his letters were censored read by guards. Delayed. Sometimes not delivered at all. He was permitted to receive Lucy's letters, but on the same censored, delayed schedule. He wrote anyway, constantly. Letters to Lucy. Letters to French officials. Letters asserting his innocence. Letters demanding to know on what evidence he had been convicted. Letters that he understood might never arrive. To people he understood might never respond. About an injustice he had no way to prove from the floor of a hot island 4,000 miles from the country that had done this to him. Lucy Dreyfus did not accept the verdict. She hired Demange to continue investigating. She wrote to every political figure she could reach. She organized Dreyfus's family. His brother Mathieu became the primary public face of the campaign to reopen the case into a sustained advocacy operation. She corresponded with Alfred constantly. She told him to hold on. She told him that she would not stop. She did not stop. The French army, watching this, was not impressed. The people running the army's intelligence apparatus who knew, by this point, that the evidence against Dreyfus was weaker than they had represented to the judges, and who suspected that some of the secret dossier might not be entirely authentic, were also watching, and they were worried. Not about Dreyfus's guilt. They had decided he was guilty. About what would happen if someone looked too closely at how they had established it. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Georges Picquart. He was 41 years old. He had served in the Franco-Prussian War as a young man, had a distinguished record, and was considered one of the more intellectually capable officers in the French army. He was, by the standards of his class and his time, conventionally conservative in his politics, and, it should be noted without sanitizing the record, had made casually anti-Semitic remarks before the Dreyfus case that were documented by contemporaries. He was not a crusader for Jewish rights. He was not motivated by any particular sympathy for Alfred Dreyfus as a person. He was motivated by the thing that makes bureaucracies occasionally produce heroes. He was good at his job. And his job, when he looked at the evidence carefully, kept telling him something that nobody else in the French army wanted to hear. In early 1896, Picquart began to review the full files of the Dreyfus investigation. Not because he doubted the verdict, he had no particular reason to, at this point, but because understanding the previous case was part of understanding how his section operated. What he found, when he looked carefully, was that the evidence against Dreyfus was considerably thinner than the army had publicly represented. The handwriting analyses were genuinely contested. The secret dossier, the additional material that had been shown to the judges, contained documents whose provenance and authenticity were, on close examination, questionable. He noted this. He set it aside. He was not, at this point, investigating an injustice. He was doing his job. Then, in March 1896, something arrived on his desk that changed everything. The Petit Bleu was a torn express telegram, addressed to Major Ferdinand Waltzen Esterhazy by the German military attaché Colonel von Schwarzkoppen. Picquart did not immediately understand what this meant, but he was a careful man, and he pulled Esterhazy's file. Ferdinand Waltzen Esterhazy was an interesting figure. He was a French army, major of nominal Hungarian-French aristocratic ancestry. The Waltzen was his mother's name. The Esterhazy, a claimed connection to the famous Hungarian noble family that he had no documented right to, who had served competently but undistinguishedly and had accumulated, over his career, serious gambling debts and a lifestyle that significantly exceeded his military salary. He was known to frequent the German embassy socially. He was also known, among officers who had served with him, as a man whose relationship to money was problematic and whose relationship to truth was flexible. Picquart pulled Esterhazy's file. He pulled samples of Esterhazy's handwriting, and then he placed Esterhazy's handwriting next to a photograph of the bordereau. The match was immediate and unmistakable. Picquart later described this moment in his memoirs. He said he sat at his desk for a long time, looking from one document to the other, checking and rechecking, because the implication of what he was seeing was so enormous that he needed to be certain he was not making a mistake. He was not making a mistake. The bordereau, the document that had sent Alfred Dreyfus to Devil's Island, had been written by Ferdinand Walson Esterhazy. Picquart now understood that he was holding, in his hands, evidence that the most significant treason conviction in recent French history was a miscarriage of justice. An innocent man was chained to a bed on a tropical island 4,000 miles away. The real spy was still in France, still in uniform, ever still drawing his salary. He did what an honorable officer should do in this situation. He assembled his evidence and went to his superiors. He presented his findings to General Gons, the deputy chief of the general staff. Gons listened, and then he said something to Picquart that became one of the more famous exchanges of the entire affair, a sentence that distilled, with terrible efficiency, the logic of institutional self-protection. What does it matter to you if this Jew stays on Devil's Island? What does it matter to you if this Jew stays on Devil's Island? Conseil was not, in this sentence, arguing that Dreyfus was guilty. He was not disputing Picquart's evidence. He was making a different argument entirely, that the question of Dreyfus's innocence was separate from the question of whether the army should do anything about it. The army had convicted Dreyfus. The conviction had been announced publicly, with the full authority of the Minister of War. The public had accepted it. The press had reported it. The anti-Semitic newspapers had built entire editorial campaigns on it. An innocent verdict would mean that all of this had been wrong. It would mean that the secret dossier had been improperly used. It would mean that General Mercier, the Minister of War who had announced he had irrefutable proof, had not had irrefutable proof. It would mean that the French army's counterintelligence apparatus had identified the wrong man and sent an innocent person to a penal colony in tropical isolation for a year and a half. The institutional consequences of acknowledging the error were, from the army's perspective, catastrophic. The institutional consequences of not acknowledging the error were, from Alfred Dreyfus's perspective, continued imprisonment for life, for a crime he had not committed. Gons chose the institution. Picquart did not let it go. He continued investigating Esterhazy. He continued building the documentary case. He prepared a comprehensive dossier, the handwriting analysis, the petit bleu, the comparison of Esterhazy's access to the information in the bordereau, the evidence of Esterhazy's financial difficulties, and his contact with the German embassy. It was a strong case. It was, by any neutral standard, more compelling than anything the army had assembled against Dreyfus. His superior's response was not to investigate Esterhazy. Their response was to transfer Picquart. In November 1896, Picquart was reassigned to Tunisia, a posting that was, in the coded language of military administration, a very clear message: you are inconvenient. You are being removed from proximity to the evidence. And this is what happens to officers who ask the wrong questions. Gonse sent him to Tunisia knowing that anti-colonial violence was active in the region, and that the posting carried genuine physical risk. The framing of the transfer was professional. The intent was not, before leaving Paris, Picquart had done something careful and consequential. He had told his lawyer and close friend, Louis Leblois, what he had found, but under strict instructions that Leblois was not to reveal the information publicly, and was not to name Picquart as the source. Picquart understood the limits of what he could do directly. He was trying to create a channel through which the truth could travel while protecting himself enough to remain able to testify if the case ever came to trial again. Leblois, bound by his promise to Picquart, told one person, Auguste Schur-Kestner, the Vice President of the French Senate, a man of impeccable Republican credentials, an Alsatian like Dreyfus, and someone with the political standing to raise the case without being immediately dismissed. Sure, Kestner could not act directly either, because he was bound by what Leblanc had told him about Piquois restrictions. But he began, quietly, to tell people that he believed Dreyfus was innocent, and that there was evidence. The word was spreading, slowly, through careful channels. Keeping names secret and sources protected, the Dreyfusard movement was beginning to exist. In November's Rapan Blas Milan Tuju, Matthew Dreyfus publicly denounced Esterhazy. He had obtained a specimen of Esterhazy's handwriting through a contact, compared it with the published facsimile of the bordereau that a newspaper had printed the previous year, and concluded, as Piquois had concluded 18 months earlier, that the match was undeniable. He went to the Minister of War. He submitted his evidence. He formally accused Esterhazy of being the author of the bordereau and the real spy. The army could no longer simply ignore the case. There was now a public accusation, with a named suspect, backed by handwriting evidence. There was a vice president of the Senate saying privately that he believed Dreyfus was innocent. The press was beginning to cover the possibility still tentatively, still carefully, but beginning that the Dreyfus verdict might have been wrong. The army's response was to put Esterhazy on trial. They acquitted him in 2 days. The acquittal of Esterhazy was the moment that radicalized the Dreyfusard movement. Before the Esterhazy trial, it was possible to argue that the army was simply maintaining an institutional position. It genuinely believed in that the evidence against Dreyfus, however flimsy it appeared from outside, was actually more substantial than the public knew. After the Esterhazy acquittal, that argument was no longer available. The army had been presented with handwriting evidence pointing to Esterhazy. The army had tried Esterhazy in 2 days, behind closed doors, and acquitted him unanimously. The army's own former head of counterintelligence had told his superiors that Dreyfus was innocent and had been transferred to a dangerous posting. The army was not making a good faith error. The army was protecting a cover-up. One man, outside the army, with no military standing and no access to classified information, decided that this was the moment to act. His name was Émile Zola. Émile Zola was 57 years old and the most famous novelist in France. His 20-volume Rougon Macquart series, a sweeping naturalist chronicle of French society under the Second Empire, had made him internationally celebrated and domestically controversial. He had won enemies with his unflinching depictions of poverty, alcoholism, and the mechanics of industrial capitalism. He had won admirers with the quality of his prose and the sincerity of his social engagement. He was not, at the time he became involved in the Dreyfus affair, a political activist in the formal sense. He was a writer who cared about justice and who had, over the course of the affair's public unfolding, become increasingly convinced that an injustice of enormous scale had been committed and was being sustained by institutional cowardice. When the Esterhazy acquittal was announced on January 11, Zola sat down and wrote. The letter was addressed to the President of the French Republic. It ran to approximately 4,000 words. It was headlined, "At Clemenceau's suggestion," with a single word, "J'accuse." I accuse. The letter did not hedge. It did not say there are questions about, or serious concerns have been raised regarding. It made specific, named accusations in the clear declarative prose of a man who had decided that clarity was the only moral option available to him. Zola accused General Mercier, the former Minister of War, who had announced irrefutable proof of making himself an accomplice in one of history's greatest iniquities. He accused the handwriting experts whose analysis had been used to convict Dreyfus of producing fraudulent and incompetent reports. He accused the officers who had directed the original investigation of conducting a press campaign designed to protect Dreyfus's guilt from examination. He accused the War Office of conducting a filthy press campaign designed to lead public opinion astray and to cover its own wrongdoing. He accused the first court-martial of having violated the law by showing judges documents that the defense could not examine. He accused the second court-martial, the Esterhazy trial, of having covered up the original crime on orders from above. Zola understood exactly what he was doing. He wrote explicitly, in the letter, that he was exposing himself to prosecution for libel, that he was deliberately inviting the government to sue him, because a libel trial would force the introduction of evidence that had been kept out of the military proceedings. He was engineering his own prosecution as a mechanism for producing a public hearing that the army had prevented. This is one of the cleverest acts of political journalism in the history of the press. Zola used the legal system that had been weaponized to suppress the truth as a vehicle for surfacing it. He filed the libel charge against himself, essentially, by making the accusations in print. And once the government filed the libel suit, which it could not avoid doing without appearing to admit the truth of the accusations, it would have to go to trial. And at trial, evidence would be presented. And evidence was what the Dreyfus art movement needed. Leroy printed 300,000 copies. It sold out. J'accuse was the most read newspaper article in the history of France to that point. Its readers did not agree with it, far from it. France divided, almost immediately, into Dreyfusards and anti-Dreyfusards. Pro-Dreyfus intellectuals lined up to sign petitions. Anti-Dreyfus crowds held rallies. Georges Clemenceau, who had published the letter, wrote daily editorials in its support. Léon Blum, the future prime minister, organized petitions among writers and academics. Marcel Proust collected signatures. Claude Monet signed. On the other side, the Catholic Church, the army, the nationalist right, the anti-Semitic press, which had never been more active, and a substantial portion of ordinary French citizens who had believed Dreyfus was guilty in 1894 and who found it deeply uncomfortable to be told, 4 years later, that they had been wrong. The affair produced anti-Semitic riots in more than 20 French cities. In Algeria, Jewish communities were attacked. The affair had not created French anti-Semitism. Drummond had been building it for a decade, but it had provided a moment in which anti-Semitic sentiment found political permission to express itself as organized violence. This is the dimension of the Dreyfus affair that connects it most directly to the longer arc of European Jewish history. The question was not merely whether Alfred Dreyfus was guilty. The question, as Zola himself framed it at his libel trial, was whether France was still the France of the Revolution, whether the Republic, which had been founded on the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity, could deliver those principles to all of its citizens equally. The anti-Dreyfusards answered, "The army matters more than one man's innocence. National honor matters more than legal process. The stability of the institutions that protect France matters more than the abstract application of justice to a Jewish officer who was probably guilty anyway." The Dreyfusards answered, "A republic that convicts an innocent man and then maintains the conviction to protect institutional credibility is not a republic. It is a tyranny, with better table manners." The Zola trial was, from the government's perspective, a trap. They needed to convict him. To not convict him would be to implicitly confirm the accusations. But convicting him required a trial. And at trial, Dreyfusard lawyers could introduce evidence. The government's solution was to conduct the trial in a way that prevented the evidence from being introduced. When Zola's attorney attempted to raise the Esterhazy evidence, the handwriting comparisons, the Petit Bleu, Picquart's findings, the presiding judge, sustained the prosecution's objections. The trial was confined, by judicial ruling, to the narrow question of whether Zola's accusations about the Esterhazy trial were defamatory. Zola was convicted. He was sentenced to 1 year in prison and a fine of 3,000 francs. He appealed. He lost the appeal. On the night before he was to surrender for his prison sentence, his attorneys and close associates persuaded him urgently. Against his initial resistance to leave France, he went to London, where he spent 11 months in exile, living in relative obscurity, writing daily letters to Alfred Dreyfus and to Clemenceau, following the affair from a distance. He was not there to see what happened next, but it happened. Back in Paris, the case was continuing to unravel. In the summer of 1898, the new Minister of War, Godefroy Cavaignac, decided that the best way to end the Dreyfus controversy was to present the full secret dossier to the Chamber of Deputies and establish, once and for all, that the evidence against Dreyfus was genuine. He wanted to close the case definitively. With evidence, he commissioned a review. The review found a problem. Officer Louis Quignet was working by lamplight. He was reviewing the secret dossier that the Minister of War had staked his credibility on. He held one of the key documents written in the hand of Major Hubert Joseph Henry, one of the Section de Statistique senior officers, purporting to establish Dreyfus's contact with German intelligence up to the light. The color of the lines on the header and footer of the paper did not match the color of the lines on the central portion. The document was a composite. The incriminating text was on a different piece of paper from the official stationery it appeared to be written on. Major Henry had forged it. Henry confessed to forging the document. He was arrested and taken to the fortress of Mont Valérien. The following morning, August 13, he was found dead in his cell. His throat had been cut. The razor was beside him. The official verdict was suicide. The questions that could have been answered if Henry had lived, who had ordered the forgeries, who had known about them, how far up the chain of command the cover-up extended, were never definitively answered. Henry took whatever he knew to his cutthroat death. Cavaignac, who had staked his ministerial position on the dossier's authenticity, resigned. Esterhazy, understanding that the game was now definitively up in France, fled to Belgium and then to London. He was later interviewed by the British press and eventually confirmed, in an interview, that he had written the bordereau. The cover-up was collapsing. The Supreme Court of Appeals agreed, in December 1898, to review the Dreyfus case. The review of the secret dossier was undertaken. The forgeries were documented. The analysis that had convicted Dreyfus was re-examined. In June 1899, Zola was permitted to return to France. Alfred Dreyfus, on Devil's Island, had spent 4 years and 2 months in conditions that had destroyed his health. He had not seen his wife or his children in 4 years. He had not seen France. He was brought back for a new trial. Alfred Dreyfus had not seen France in 4 years and 4 months. He had not seen his wife or his children. He had spent those years in a stone hut on a tropical island, chained to his bed at night, in conditions that the Red Cross, had it existed in its modern form at the time, would have classified as constituting cruel and degrading treatment. His health was compromised. His hair was white. He was 40 years old. He had maintained, throughout all of it, the position that he was innocent, not because he had managed to achieve some elevated spiritual equanimity about his situation, because he was innocent. And he knew it, and the knowledge stubbornly, at considerable personal cost, had not left him. He was brought to Rennes for a new court-martial. The Rennes trial ran from August 7 to September 9, 1899, 34 days, considerably longer than the 3-day proceeding in 1894. The evidence was presented in full. Picot testified. Dreyfus's attorneys introduced the handwriting analyses. The Petit Blot, the documented forgeries of Major Henry, the confession of Esterhazy. The defense case was comprehensive, documented, and by any neutral standard overwhelming. And then the military tribunal delivered its verdict. On September 9, 1899, the military court-martial at Rennes found Alfred Dreyfus guilty of treason. Again, by a vote of 5-2, with extenuating circumstances. The world reacted with something approaching unified disbelief. Governments expressed formal concern. The British press was scathing. The American press was baffled. The German government, whose military attaché's wastebasket had started the whole affair, quietly confirmed, through diplomatic channels, that Dreyfus had never been in contact with German intelligence. In France, the reaction split along the familiar lines. The anti-Dreyfusards celebrated. The Dreyfusards were devastated, and the international community began, in several countries, to organize boycotts of the upcoming Paris Universal Exposition of 1,900 inches, protest of a verdict that made France look, to the watching world, like a country that had decided institutional pride mattered more than justice. The phrase extenuating circumstances is worth dwelling on. In the legal language of French military courts, extenuating circumstances reduced the mandatory sentence for treason from life deportation to 10 years detention. The judges who added this phrase to their guilty verdict were, in the only way available to them within the constraints of an institution they were not willing to contradict outright, signaling that they did not entirely believe what they had just voted. 5 of 7 judges voted guilty. 2 voted not guilty. The 5 who voted guilty added extenuating circumstances to soften what they had done. What this tells us: the majority of the court did not have the courage of its convictions. Not literally they had found Dreyfus guilty, but they knew, at some level, that they were doing something that did not add up, and the extenuating circumstances was the institutional equivalent of a man saying, "I know this doesn't look right, but I'm saying it anyway." This is institutions at their most craven, not the bold injustice of the first verdict, but the equivocating injustice of the second. Not we believe he is guilty, but we are maintaining that he is guilty, with a modifier that suggests we aren't entirely sure, because we cannot bring ourselves to contradict the institution we serve, even when the evidence requires us to. The French government, watching the international reaction, made a rapide calculation. 10 days after the Rennes verdict, President Émile Loubet issued a presidential pardon. Dreyfus was free, but the pardon was not an exoneration. It was a pardon which in French law explicitly acknowledged the conviction as valid while forgiving the sentence. Accepting a pardon meant, legally, accepting guilt. Dreyfus, who had spent 5 years on Devil's Island and 4 years fighting a legal battle for his innocence, was now being offered freedom, contingent on accepting guilt. Dreyfus's supporters were divided. His brother Mathieu, who had devoted years of his life to the campaign and who understood the physical condition Alfred was in after 5 years on Devil's Island, urged him to accept. Clemenceau urged him to refuse, arguing that accepting the pardon would allow the army's cover-up to stand as the official record. Dreyfus accepted the pardon. He was released on September 19. He issued a statement at the same time. The government of the Republic gives me back my freedom. It is nothing for me without my honor. He was free. He was not exonerated. The fight was not over. He would spend the next 7 years as a free man, but as a man with a conviction on his record, as a man who could not serve in the army he had devoted his life to, as a man whose name in France was still officially associated with treason, continuing the campaign for full exoneration. The legal campaign continued. In 1903, Dreyfus submitted a formal request for revision of the verdict to the Minister of War. The investigation took years. In 1906, the Court of Cassation, the highest court in France, reviewed the case in full. On July 12, 1906, the Court of Cassation annulled the conviction without ordering a new trial. It found that no crime had been committed by Dreyfus and that the guilty verdict had been based on illegally obtained and forged evidence. Alfred Dreyfus was fully and formally exonerated. He was reinstated in the French army. He was promoted to the rank of Major. He was awarded the Legion of Honor, the highest French decoration, in a ceremony at the École Militaire, in the same courtyard where he had been publicly degraded 12 years earlier. He stood in the same courtyard. He wore the decoration that had been torn from him in 1895. He was 56 years old. 12 years of his life had been consumed by an injustice that 17 words, j'accuse, a forged letter, a piece of paper in a wastebasket, had set in motion. And Georges Picot, the man who had found the truth and been punished for it, was fully rehabilitated. He was promoted. He was eventually appointed Minister of War in Clemenceau's government. The man who had been sent to Tunisia so that he could not testify about what he knew became the head of the institution that had tried to silence him. This is the part of the Dreyfus affair that makes it, among the case studies in this season, the closest thing to a happy ending. The innocent man was exonerated. The man who did his duty was rewarded. The institution that manufactured the guilt was reformed. But the happy ending took 12 years. It cost Alfred Dreyfus his health and a decade of his life. It cost Picot his career during the years he spent waiting for vindication. It cost Zola 11 months of exile. It cost Lucy Dreyfus 12 years of sustained, exhausting advocacy for a husband who was 4,000 miles away and could not help himself. And it produced, as a side effect, something that the people involved could not have predicted and might not have wished for. It produced Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl was 34 years old when he covered the degradation ceremony. He was the Paris correspondent for the Neue Freie Presse, Vienna's leading newspaper, a prestigious posting that reflected both his talents and his ambitions. He was also, in the way that many educated, assimilated European Jews of his generation were, someone who had organized his life around the belief that the Jewish question had been, or was in the process of being, resolved by the Enlightenment's promise of civic equality. Alfred Dreyfus was the embodiment of that belief. He was more French than many native-born Frenchmen. He spoke perfect French. He had served in the French army. He had risen to the general staff. He had done everything that civic integration required, and France had convicted him of treason on forged evidence, chained him to a bed on a tropical island, and sent crowds into the streets to demand death to the Jews. Herzl later wrote, famously, "The Dreyfus trial made me a Zionist." This is an oversimplification. Herzl's biographers have noted that his movement toward Zionism had other sources and a more gradual development than this single dramatic statement implies, but it captures something essential about the Dreyfus affair's impact on European Jewish political thought. The affair was not, for Herzl, primarily a story about one man's innocence or guilt. It was a story about what assimilation could and could not protect. Dreyfus had done everything right. He had been more French than the French army that convicted him. He had been an officer, a patriot, a man who had subordinated his Jewish identity to his French identity with complete, sincere commitment, and none of it had been enough. When the army needed a spy and looked at its officers, it had seen first, before examining the handwriting evidence carefully, before conducting a rigorous investigation, the Jewish one, not because the evidence pointed to him, because the assumption pointed to him, because a century of civic equality had not erased the underlying structure of the prejudice that made a Jewish officer when a spy was needed. The most convenient candidate, der Judenstaat. The Jewish State was published in February 1896. It was short, direct, and extraordinarily consequential. Herzl argued that anti-Semitism was not an aberration, not a holdover from medieval ignorance that modernity would resolve. It was a structural feature of the relationship between Jewish minorities and European majorities, and it would not be eliminated by Jewish integration or education or civic virtue. The only solution, Herzl argued, was the creation of a Jewish state, a territory where Jews would not be minorities dependent on the goodwill of others, but a majority governing themselves. The argument was not new. Other Zionist thinkers had made versions of it before Herzl. What Herzl brought was the urgency of personal witness, the experience of watching Alfred Dreyfus's degradation and hearing the crowd outside the gate, and the organizational energy to transform a theoretical argument into a political movement. The First Zionist Congress met in Basel in August 1897. 204 delegates from 17 countries attended. It was the first time that Zionism had been formally constituted as an international political movement with stated goals, organizational structures, and a program. Herzl wrote in his diary after the Congress, "At Basel I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, I would be answered by universal laughter. Perhaps in 5 years, certainly in 50, everyone will know it. He was wrong about 5 years. He was right about 50. Exactly 50 years after the Basel Congress, in 1947, the United Nations voted to partition the British Mandate of Palestine into separate Arab and Jewish states. In May 1948, 51 years after Basel, the State of Israel declared independence. Herzl had died in 1904, at 44 years old, from heart disease, without living to see it. Alfred Dreyfus died in 1935, at 75 years old. He had been reinstated in the French army after his exoneration, had served in the First World War, and had lived to see France, which had destroyed him with a lie in 1894, defend itself against Germany with his participation in 1914. He did not live to see the Holocaust. He did not live to see Israel. He did not live to understand the full scale of the chain of events that his courtyard degradation had helped set in motion. The Boston Globe, in a retrospective piece on Jacques, noted that the effects of the Dreyfus affair continued long after Dreyfus himself was buried, the anti-Dreyfusards in time becoming the pro-fascist core of the Vichy regime. This is not a casual observation. The political tradition that had defended Dreyfus's conviction, the Catholic nationalist right, and the anti-republican forces that had used the affair to argue that France's Jewish minority was a dangerous foreign body within the national organism did not disappear when Dreyfus was exonerated. It went underground. It regrouped. It emerged in the 1930s as the ideological current that collaborated with Nazi Germany when Germany occupied France in 1940. The Dreyfus affair did not cause the Holocaust. The chain of causation is not that direct, but the political tradition that the Dreyfus affair crystallized and the political tradition that produced Vichy France are connected not coincidentally but structurally, as expressions of the same underlying claim that national identity required the exclusion or subordination of Jews. The Dreyfus affair produced, as one of its more concrete and immediate institutional consequences, the separation of church and state in France. The 1905 Loi de Séparation, the law that formally established the secular character of the French Republic and removed the Catholic Church from official public life, was the direct result of a political realignment that the Dreyfus affair had accelerated. The Church had been one of the most committed anti-Dreyfusard institutions. Its newspapers, its clergy, its organizational networks had been deployed in defense of the guilty verdict. When the verdict collapsed, and when the Church's role in sustaining it became visible, the political argument for formal secularism, laïcité, became irresistible to the Republican majority. France is still, today, a formally secular republic. The principle of laïcité shapes French politics, French education, and French debates about religion and public life in ways that distinguish France from most other Western democracies. That principle, in its current form, was hardened and institutionalized by the political consequences of a miscarriage of justice in 1894. Jacques Hughes established a template for a kind of journalism, or more precisely, a kind of public intellectual intervention using journalism as its vehicle that did not exist in the same form before January 13. 1898. The specific combination, a famous person, using their public platform to make specific and named accusations of institutional misconduct, in language precise enough to constitute legal exposure, in the explicit knowledge that the legal consequences would produce a public hearing that institutional power had prevented. This is Zola's invention, or at least Zola's most powerful instantiation. The 200,000 copies of L'Aurore sold on January 13, 1898, were not just readers of a newspaper. They were participants in the first media event of the modern kind, the first time that a piece of writing had so directly and immediately turned a specific political question into a mass democratic experience. The Dreyfus affair was, as the Boston Globe observed, the first legal ordeal to trigger a media feeding frenzy, the moment when journalism discovered that it could function not just as a record of events but as a participant in them, that the press was not merely observing the affair but, through Jacques Hughes and the publications that followed it, helping to determine its outcome. This is a power that has been used well and used badly in the century since. Zola used it well. His accusations were accurate. His cause was just, and the institutional misconduct he described was real and documented. The template he established has also been used by people whose accusations were less accurate and whose causes were less just. Because templates do not come with ethical constraints built in. But the template exists, and it exists because a French novelist, watching an institution defend a lie at the cost of an innocent man's life, decided that the only adequate response was clarity at the highest possible volume. The Dreyfus affair ended, officially, in 1906. Its consequences are still running. We have now examined 4 big lies in this season. The protocols of the Elders of Zion, manufactured enemy. The stab in the back myth, manufactured defeat. The lost cause, manufactured nobility. The Dreyfus affair, manufactured guilt. Each of these myths operates on different emotional territory. The protocols asked you to fear. The stab in the back asked you to feel betrayed. The lost cause asked you to feel proud of something that required you not to look too closely. The Dreyfus affair did something different from all of these. It did not primarily ask its audience for an emotion. It asked its audience for a verdict. The Dreyfus affair is a case study not in how propaganda works. The other big lies in this season are better examples of that, but in how institutional guilt works. How an organization that has made a mistake decides, consciously or gradually, that the cost of acknowledging the mistake is higher than the cost of sustaining it. And what happens, step by step, as the effort to sustain the mistake requires more and more of the institution's resources, more and more departures from its stated values, until the cover-up has become the primary activity and the original mission has become secondary. Let us build the anatomy of manufactured guilt with the same care we have applied to the other mechanisms in this season. Manufactured guilt has 5 structural components. Every case of manufactured guilt begins with a situation in which an institution needs to identify responsibility for something, a crime, a failure, a scandal, and finds itself looking at a field of candidates. The selection of the convenient suspect is not usually a fully conscious decision. It is more often the operation of existing biases that make one candidate feel more likely than the others, without requiring that the evidence actually support this feeling. In Dreyfus' case, the bias was anti-Semitism. The section de statistique, led by officers with documented anti-Semitic views, looked at a list of candidates and selected the one whose identity made him feel most suspicious, the one whose Jewishness, in the France of 1894, was already associated in the anti-Semitic imagination with disloyalty to France. The handwriting evidence was not examined neutrally and then compared to Dreyfus. Dreyfus was selected first intuitively, based on bias, and then the handwriting evidence was evaluated in a way that confirmed the selection. 3 experts agreed. 2 disagreed. The 3 who agreed were cited. The 2 who disagreed were set aside. This is confirmation bias, operating in an institutional context. It is not unusual. It is, in fact, extremely common, which is why forensic science has spent the last century developing blind analysis protocols, evidence chain of custody rules, and adversarial testing procedures specifically to counteract it. In 1894 France, none of these safeguards existed in meaningful form, and even where procedural safeguards exist, they can be circumvented by institutional pressure, by the knowledge shared among investigators of who the institution wants to be guilty. The convenient suspect is not the product of evil. It is the product of bias operating in an institutional context that does not have adequate safeguards to detect and correct it. This is important to understand because the narrative of manufactured guilt can be misread as requiring a villain, a Colonel Sandhair who deliberately and maliciously chose to frame Dreyfus. Sandhair was anti-Semitic, and he was not careful. He was not, in the evidence available, running a deliberate frame-up from the beginning. He was doing what prejudiced people do. He looked at the candidates and saw Dreyfus as most suspicious because of who Dreyfus was. And then he assembled evidence that confirmed the conclusion his bias had already reached. The deliberate manufacture of guilt came later, when the institutional cover-up began. But it began with something more mundane, a man with a bias doing his job badly. Once the convenient suspect has been identified and the initial evidence has been assembled around them, institution commits. In Dreyfus' case, this commitment was made publicly and at the highest level. The Minister of War announced he had irrefutable proof. This announcement was not merely strategic, it was the moment at which the institution's credibility became formally attached to the verdict. Once that attachment is made, the calculus changes. The evidence is no longer being examined to determine guilt or innocence. It is being assembled to support a verdict that the institution has already committed to publicly. The 2 processes look identical from outside. They are structurally opposite. The evidence trap is the moment at which an investigative process becomes a confirmation process, when the question changes from what does the evidence show to how do we make the evidence show what we need it to show. In the Dreyfus case, this is visible in the secret dossier. The dossier was assembled because the original evidence was insufficient. It was presented to the judges without the defense's knowledge, because adversarial examination would have revealed its weakness. It was classified as too sensitive to share because classification is the institutional mechanism that most effectively prevents examination. The evidence trap produces a specific problem. The more the institution commits to a verdict, the more it needs evidence to support that verdict. And the more pressure there is on investigators to produce that evidence by whatever means necessary. This is the pressure that produced Major Henry's forgeries. Not primarily personal malice. Institutional pressure to produce evidence for a verdict that the evidence did not naturally support. Henry's forgeries were not the work of a criminal mastermind. They were the work of a man under institutional pressure, using the tools available to him: scissors, buster, official stationery from different files to produce documents that said what his superiors needed them to say. The clumsy quality of the forgery is visible to the naked eye when held to the light. As Quignette discovered, is not incidental. It reflects the reality that Henry was not a skilled forger. He was an intelligence officer doing an inadequate job of something he should never have been asked to do. The request, implicit or explicit, for forgeries is the institution's most damning moment. Not because it was the worst moral failure in the Dreyfus affair. Gance's "What does it matter if this Jew stays on Devil's Island" was worse, but because it is the clearest evidence of conscious, deliberate institutional decision-making. The forgeries were not accidents. Someone decided they were necessary. The most haunting dimension of the Dreyfus affair is not the active cover-up. It is the passive participation of people who knew or suspected that something was wrong and said nothing. Piquart is the exception. His willingness to raise the Esterhazy evidence with his superiors, knowing it would be unwelcome, knowing it would cost him, is what makes him the moral center of the affair. He was not a hero in a simple sense. He was an officer who found evidence that contradicted an institutional position, reported it through appropriate channels, was transferred to a dangerous posting as a result, and did not stop. But Piquart was exceptional. The institutional norm in the Dreyfus affair, as in every institutional cover-up, was silence. Officers who suspected problems remained silent because speaking meant career consequences. Investigators who saw anomalies in the evidence filed their reports and moved on. Judges who were shown a secret dossier without the defense's knowledge accepted the irregularity rather than questioning it. None of these silences required conscious evil. They required only the ordinary human calculus of risk and reward, speaking up at a high personal cost, staying silent at a low personal cost, and the injustice being sustained was happening to someone else. This is the banal infrastructure of institutional cover-ups, not mustache-twirling villains. Ordinary people making ordinary calculations about what their silence costs them versus what their silence costs someone else. The collective silence of the people who knew or who could have known, if they had chosen to look, is what gave the Dreyfus affair its duration. Without those silences, the case would have collapsed within months. With them, it lasted 12 years. This is why institutional accountability mechanisms matter, not because individuals cannot be trusted, but because the ordinary human calculus of risk and reward, in the absence of external accountability, almost always produces silence. Whistleblower protections, independent oversight, adversarial legal proceedings, a free press. These are not luxuries in a democratic system. They are the structural counterweights to the ordinary human tendency to stay quiet about things that cost others but not oneself. Piquart was a good man, but a system that depends on finding good men willing to sacrifice their careers to correct institutional injustice is a bad system. Good men exist in finite supply. Good institutional design should not require them. Every institutional cover-up faces the same structural problem. It requires more cover-up over time. The original error, Dreyfus' conviction on insufficient evidence, was relatively small in the scale of the Dreyfus affair's eventual misconduct. What transformed it into the defining scandal of the French Third Republic was not the original error but the institutional decision, made repeatedly over years, to escalate rather than correct. Each escalation made the next more necessary. Piquart's findings were suppressed, which required transferring Piquart, which required forging documents to make the existing case stronger, which required silencing witnesses, which required conducting a sham trial of Esterhazy, which required convicting Zola for libel, which required somehow impossibly convicting Dreyfus again at Rennes in 1899. By Rennes, the army was not defending a guilty verdict. It was defending 12 years of escalating institutional misconduct that had begun with a guilty verdict. The stakes were no longer whether Dreyfus was guilty. They were whether an entire generation of French army leadership would be held accountable for what they had done to maintain a conviction they had reasons to doubt from the beginning. This is the escalation imperative. The cover-up becomes progressively more difficult to end because ending it at any point means accounting for everything that was done to maintain it. The later you admit the error, the more you are admitting, and so the calculus keeps pushing toward escalation. Even when the people involved understand that escalation is making things worse. Loren's verdict, guilty, with extenuating circumstances, is the clearest demonstration of the escalation imperative in the entire affair. 5 out of 7 judges voted guilty for a man who the evidence overwhelmingly showed was innocent. Because after 12 years of institutional commitment to his guilt, the alternative to voting guilty was voting to acknowledge everything that had been done to produce and sustain that guilt. The Dreyfus affair's resolution came not from within the institution but from outside it. Piquart worked within the institution and was suppressed. The Dreyfus family worked through official channels and were ignored. The case broke open because of forces external to the army, journalism, the civilian court system, political pressure, international opinion. J'accuse was the critical external intervention not because it contained new evidence that was not already available, but because it made the question of Dreyfus's guilt a public political issue that could not be contained within the army's internal procedures. Once the question was public, the army could not simply suppress the evidence. It had to respond, and responding, trying Zola, conducting the Esterhazy court-martial, staking Cavaignac's ministerial position on the dossier's authenticity, produced the conditions in which the forgeries were eventually discovered. The external corrective does not always work. The Dreyfus affair's relatively good ending relative to the amount of injustice it contained was not guaranteed. It required a specific combination of circumstances: a defendant with family resources and determination, a journalist with platform and courage, a politician with standing, an international press paying attention, and eventually a civilian court with the jurisdiction and the will to override the military system. Remove any of these elements and the case looks different. Remove Lucy Dreyfus's determination and Matthew's organizing, and the campaign does not develop. Remove Zola's intervention, and the case remains a specialist debate rather than a national crisis. Remove the international attention, and the government is not pressured to act. Remove the 1,906 Court of Cassation's willingness to fully annul the verdict, and Dreyfus ends his life with a pardon but not an exoneration. The external corrective is not a mechanism. It is a set of conditions that must be created and sustained by people willing to accept the personal cost of doing so. The Dreyfus affair is exceptional in its drama, in its scale, in its consequences, but the mechanism it exemplifies is not exceptional at all. Every country with a functioning criminal justice system has wrongful convictions in its record. The Innocence Project, founded in 1992 and now operating internationally, has, as of recent years, helped exonerate more than 375 wrongfully convicted people in the United States alone, many of whom spent decades in prison for crimes they did not commit. The structural causes of wrongful convictions, documented across hundreds of case studies, are consistent: eyewitness misidentification, false confessions produced under interrogative pressure, unreliable forensic evidence presented with more certainty than the science supports, and most relevant to the Dreyfus pattern, institutional commitment to a verdict that makes subsequent correction politically or professionally costly. The specific charge that Zola made in J'accuse that the army had shown the judges evidence that the defense could not see describes a practice that has produced wrongful convictions in multiple countries and multiple eras. The Brady Rule in American law, which requires prosecutors to disclose exculpatory evidence to the defense, was established in 1963 precisely because the practice of withholding evidence from defendants was producing unjust outcomes. The Brady Rule violation, prosecutors hiding evidence that would help the defendant, is one of the most commonly cited causes of wrongful conviction in American legal history. The Dreyfus Affair described this practice in 1894. The United States codified the rule against it in 1963, and Brady violations continue to be documented in American courts today. The mechanism is not French. It is not 19th century. It is institutional. The manufactured guilt mechanism is not confined to criminal justice. Every institution that has ever had to choose between acknowledging an error and concealing it has faced the same structural dynamics that produced the Dreyfus Affair. The tobacco industry's internal research established, decades before the information became public, that cigarettes cause cancer. The convenience suspects the smokers themselves. Blamed for their choices was selected. The evidence trapped the framing of the question as one of personal responsibility rather than product defect was set. The silence of those who knew the scientists and executives who saw the internal research was maintained through NDAs and professional pressure. The escalation imperative drove decades of public denial and political lobbying against regulation. The external corrective came, eventually, through litigation and journalism and government investigation. The pattern is the same. The institution is different. The harm was considerably larger. This is the Dreyfus Affair's deepest lesson. The mechanism of manufactured guilt does not require a Jewish officer in the French army. It requires an institution that has made a mistake, a convenient person or explanation to blame for it, and the ordinary human calculation that acknowledging error costs more than concealing it. These conditions are not rare. They are the default. What the Dreyfus Affair also produced, and this is the hopeful note, carefully stated, is a model of what actually works against manufactured guilt, not exposing the conspiracy in the abstract, specific, named, documented accusations in a venue where they cannot be suppressed, not working within the institutional channels that the institution controls, finding the external correctives, the civilian courts, the international press, and the political processes that exist outside the institution's jurisdiction, not hoping that people inside the institution will speak up because it is right, building the structural incentives, whistleblower protections, adversarial legal processes, freedom of information laws that make speaking up less personally catastrophic, and, fundamentally, not waiting for the institution to correct itself. It won't, not because the people in it are villains, but because the ordinary calculus of institutional self-interest almost always runs against voluntary disclosure of error. The Dreyfus Affair was corrected not by the French army finding its conscience. It was corrected by a novelist writing 4,000 words on the front page of a newspaper, by a vice president of the Senate going public with what he knew, by a brother who refused to stop organizing, by a wife who refused to stop writing letters, and eventually by a civilian court with the courage to annul a verdict that 12 years of institutional pressure had tried to make permanent. These are the actual mechanisms of correction. They are unglamorous. They are slow. They are unreliable. They work sometimes, and they fail other times. And the difference between the cases where they work and the cases where they fail is often a matter of resources and luck, and who has the platform and who does not. But they are what we have, and the Dreyfus Affair is the documentation of them working imperfectly, at enormous cost. Over 12 years against one of the most thoroughly entrenched institutional cover-ups in modern history. Alfred Dreyfus did nothing wrong. He served France faithfully, professionally, with the complete commitment of a man who believed that his country's principles meant what they said. France convicted him on forged evidence, chained him to a bed in the tropics for 5 years, convicted him again when the forgeries were exposed. And eventually, after 12 years, and at the cost of the health and liberty that the prison years consumed, acknowledged that it had been wrong. The acknowledgement was real. It was formal. It was, in the legal sense, complete. It came 12 years too late. In the crowd outside the gates of the École Militaire in January 1895, a journalist heard the mob screaming death to the Jews, watched a decorated officer being publicly destroyed for a crime committed by someone else, and went home to write a book that would, 50 years later, help birth a state. The Dreyfus affair did not end in 1906. Its consequences are still arriving. That is what manufactured guilt costs. Not just the person it targets, everyone in the vicinity of the institution that produces it, everyone downstream of the truths it suppresses and the lies it maintains. The bill, when it comes due, is always larger than the institution expected, and it always comes due